I'm David Bosco. I'm Professor of Competition Law at Aix-Marseille University in France. And welcome to this webinar on the regulation of digital platforms in Europe. This webinar is organized by the Center of Economic Law here in Aix-en-Provence and by the Institute of Business Law. It has been prepared by the students of the Economic Law degree of the Institute of Business Law. Well, if you have to pick up your children from school, which is not a very good excuse at the moment, or if you suddenly have a power cut that prevents you from following this webinar to the end, you should know that everything is recorded and that the video will be available on our competition forum platform. I would like to add that this conference is sponsored by ASCOLA, Academic Society for Competition Law. Well, you may wonder why it is still necessary to devote yet another webinar to the European Commission's initiative on platform regulation. And my answer is very simple, because we have managed to have with us Professor Podszun, who is one of Europe's leading experts on this issue, and that's written enough to organize the webinar just for that. So Ruprecht is Professor of Civil and Competition Law at the Heinrich Heine University of Dusseldorf. He is also Vice President of the ASCOLA Academic Society I just mentioned, and above all, as I said, is one of the most influential academics on the issue we are dealing with today. So Ruprecht was to be a guest at the University of Aix-Marseille this year, but the pandemic made our exchange digital, but well, I guess it's just a postponement. So for today, we will proceed as follows. The students of the Economic Law degree will introduce the topic for about 1 hour. And then we will discuss with Ruprecht the evolutions we have these days in Europe on the regulation of the digital platform. Finally, there will be an open discussion with all the participants, whom I would also like to thank for joining us today. So once again, I would like to thank you, Ruprecht, for being with us today. And I'm going to leave the floor to the students, and the first one of them is Gaspar, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Ruprecht. As an introduction, I will talk about the specificity of the digital economy. So as you all know, the European single market is founded on free market theory. The core idea of this theory is to let numerous decisions of individuals or businesses drive the economy. The invisible hand of the market is supposed to coordinate exchanges so supply can meet demand. In free markets, a competition based on merits allows the best product or service to win. However, the digital economy, and especially big platforms, appears to work differently. Indeed, if successful, a platform will often run a market for itself. The reason why is that network effect makes one platform more and more attractive the more users it can get. Since the costs generated by new users are very low for digital services, platforms are able to make massive economy of scales. Furthermore, a dominant position in a digital market offers a privileged access to data. This privileged access gives an exponential advantage over competitors. This often leads a market to tip. A tipping market is a situation where the winner takes it all. The invisible hand of the market is then replaced by the algorithm put in place by these platform operators. This process is not in itself problematic, since digital platforms significantly reduce transaction costs with dynamic and innovative solutions. However, it demands vigilance. Platform operators, as a gateway to consumers, have a superior bargaining power over their contractors. Undertakings in this position are called gatekeepers. Indeed, suppliers who want to access this platform in order to sell goods or services have a strong economic dependency on them. Then suppliers might no longer compete to access to consumers, but compete to access to platforms themselves. There is a risk that some of them will be excluded from a market, not because of economic inefficiency, but because of unfair terms of trade. Thus, the choice of consumers might be limited for wrong reasons. The ambition of platforms to create their own digital ecosystem raises several issues. They may, and actually did, use their quasi-monopolistic position in one market to dramatically improve their position in another market, as well as to integrate more services under their domination. So as Mr. Podszun mentioned in his report, Google, for instance, offers a flight search tool within the general search engine. Google's prominence as a search platform allows him to rank its own flight search higher than competing platforms. Thus, these competitors may likely be driven out of the market, even if they are technically more efficient. As a result, Google dominance extends to another field of services, although it does not provide for superior skills, foresight, or industry. Another issue is called killer acquisition. This is a merger strategy which aims to identify and target potential future competitors as soon as they enter the market when there are only small businesses and to acquire them. Some of these startups might have been really innovating, but unfortunately, their potential is hindered by leading platforms. So now I will briefly show you some examples of case law in the European Union regarding digital economy. So through different cases, the so-called big techs, also known under the acronym of GAFAM, were sentenced for the non-respect of European competition law. For instance, the Google shopping case. In this case, Google used its algorithm to bias the result in order to exclude competitors. Indeed, Google Shopping, which is a price comparator tool, was favored since its results appear first. On the other hand, competing comparator platforms appeared further away in pages people never look at. The European Commission wondered whether manipulation of results coming from algorithm to deter competitors' position was an infringement to competition law. The fact Google had a dominant position on a search engine market and relied on its dominant position to extend this domination toward a market in which it was not dominant before, allowed the Commission to declare that there was an infringement of dominant position, according to Article 102 of the TFEU. The European Court of Justice upheld this decision, so in the end, Google was fined 2.4 billion euros. Another interesting case is the WhatsApp-Facebook merger case in 2014. In this case, Facebook wanted to take over WhatsApp and merge. At a European level, it is provided that cases where turnovers amount to a certain threshold must be notified and then controlled by the Commission. While Facebook obviously did have an enormous turnover, in this specific case, WhatsApp was a free app and did not have a sufficient turnover. Therefore, the Commission wasn't notified, neither had competence in order to control this merger. This means that it could not prohibit nor do anything to prevent this acquisition. Therefore, the Austrian and German competition authorities adapted their competition tools and decided to take into account the value of the total transaction. So, above a certain threshold of the transaction amount, the competition authorities must be notified. What matters now in Germany is that the turnover is not the turnover of each company, but the value of the total transaction. So now I will leave the floor for my colleague Jean-Romain. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaspar. So, hi everyone. I will talk about the pre-existing rules in terms of platform regulation and their limits. The e-commerce directive, which is more than 20 years old, is now obsolete, and it no longer responds to the current challenges. The European legislations in terms of platform regulation are the e-commerce directive, the e-platform to business regulation, and the directives that were adopted as part of the New Deal for consumers. The potential new tools would not replace those, but will apply in addition to them. The existing text did not foresee, for example, the presence of gatekeepers which control the digital markets by establishing their own rules which are sometimes unfair for the businesses which want to access their platforms. Since its publication, the e-commerce directive has evolved many times. Despite the various contributions of these changes, it is necessary to create a new legislative framework governing the digital market. The old, too limited, do no longer make it possible to respond to the exponential growth of companies in the digital sector. The main problem with the old legislations is that there are only ex post regulations. The Commission's services are unable to act quickly due to the huge amount of data to compile. Because of procedural slowness, when a decision is rendered, it is too late. Usually, the harm has already been done, sometimes heavily, with irreversible effects, and without any possible restoration measures. To conclude, the exponential development of digital contents generated the need to reform and adapt our legislation at the same time as the development of digital platforms. Next topic, the purpose of the reform. As Mr. Podszun mentioned it in his report, values that should govern our vision of digital economy are free competition, fair intermediation, and sovereignty of users in decision-making. As we said, application of the Articles 101 and 102 of the TFEU and the merger control do not allow to prevent certain abuses. Therefore, the Commission, in June 2020, has proposed an initial impact assessment and a public consultation opened until September 2020 about a new competition tool that it plans to create. Numerous approaches have been introduced. The NCT could target either all companies or only those in dominant position. The NCT could target either all sectors or only the digital one, since it is considered to be problematic, as we just explained. However, this NCT, this new competition tool, has been frowned upon by many, such as the AFEP, the French Association of Private Companies. They consider that the existing tools, such as the national authorities, are sufficient, and that they already proved multiple times their plasticity by adapting to economic developments. One proposition about the NCT was to allow the Commission, after a market study, to decide structural or behavioral measures towards specific undertakings. Such decisions will depend on the competitive impact identified. The Commission could also send recommendations to the targeted undertakings. This proposition was inspired by the British competition tool called market investigations. Next topic, the inspiration from market investigations in the United Kingdom. Market investigations allow the UK competition authorities to investigate markets when particular features are likely to give rise to anti-competitive effects, which might not be captured by other competition rules. The focus of these investigations is generally upon industry-wide practices that appear to be harming competition rather than the behavior of a specific firm. Regarding the legislation framework, the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act 2013 establishes the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, as the UK's competition authority responsible for ensuring that competition and markets work well for consumers. The CMA can launch a market investigation if it has good reasons to think that any feature or combination of features of a market in the UK prevents, restricts, or distorts competition. To do so, the CMA undertakes a market study. It means that it uses market studies to educate itself about a market, looking at the economic and regulatory drivers and patterns of consumers and business behavior. After going through the market investigation process, the CMA decides whether there is an adverse effect on competition, an AEC, or not. And if there is an AEC, it must then decide whether action should be taken to remedy the effects identified, and if so, what action. Next topic, the given up project of structural injunction. Another option that was considered was to target non-dominant companies that have power in a market or in related markets, regardless whether or not they committed any infringement. This option was criticized by many economic actors since the concept of having power in a market has not clearly been defined. Moreover, this new competition tool option would not have clearly delimited the targeted market, digital or not, European or global. Potentially, any economic actor in an IFWA dominant position without infringing any competition rule might have come within the scope of this tool based on the analysis of market structures. Such an instrument would lead the Commission to pronounce behavioral or structural remedies against companies which have not committed any infringement. It seemed contrary to the principle of legality. Moreover, this instrument would have allowed the Commission to render enforceable decisions, which is contrary to the principle of legal certainty. This would actually have resulted in legal insecurity for economic actors, limitation of their entrepreneurial freedom, as well as their strategies for expansion or innovation in the European market. Therefore, this option was no longer discussed and replaced by less coercive ones. Eventually, agreeing with the Commission's analysis that the large platforms, the gatekeepers, have an impact on the functioning of competition, everyone recognized the need for ex-ante regulations. This approach is now considered by the Commission about digital services. Mr. Podszun, do you think ex-ante regulations will necessarily limit the freedom of digital platforms? Thank you, and now I leave the floor to my colleague.
Thank you, Gaspard. Thank you, Jean-Romain. Now I will be speaking about the Digital Services Act. So first, where does the DSA come from? New and innovative business models and services, such as online social networks and marketplace, have allowed business users and consumers to communicate and access information. A majority of European Union citizens now uses those services on a daily basis. The digital transformation and increased use of those services has also resulted in new risks and challenges for individual users and for society. So member states are introducing, or at least are considering introducing, national laws on the matters covered by this regulation, imposing diligence requirements for providers of intermediary services. So what is the main idea? The main idea is to harmonize provision for the internal market, is for businesses to exploit the benefits of the internal market with easy access and opportunities. And it is also for consumers and other recipients of the service to have increased choices. And how are these goals reached? They are by establishing a targeted set of uniform, effective, and proportionate mandatory rules at union level. So this regulation provides the condition for innovative digital services to emerge by using requirements that are technology neutral. So keep in mind that innovation should not be hampered, but instead be stimulated. Now I will be walking you through the chapters, and keep in mind that the key chapters here are number 3 and 4. So chapter 1 sets out general provision, including the subject matter and scope of the regulation and the definition of key terms used in the regulation. So who is concerned, who is targeted? This regulation should apply only to intermediary services and not affect product or services intermediated through those services. Intermediary services are defined in Article 2 of the GSA and include the following activities. So we find firstly a mere conduct. A mere conduct is the transmission of an information provided by a recipient of the service or the access in a communication network. Then we have a caching service. It is the same as a mere conduct, only it involves the automatic intermediate and temporary storage of that information. And lastly, we find a hosting service that consists of the storage of information provided and at the request of a recipient of the service. So which providers are concerned? So the ones providing services in the union regardless of their establishments or residence. For example, if we have a provider based in Dubai but is providing services in the union, he is concerned by the DSA. Now, Chapter 2 contains provision on the exemption of liability of providers of intermediary services. More specifically, the exemption from liability for the third-party information they transmit and store. Then moving on to Chapter 3. Chapter 3 sets out the due diligence obligation for a transparent and safe online environment in 5 different sections. Here, we will notice that the obligation grow increasingly, they go crescendo. So we find rules applicable to all providers of intermediary services. So they have to establish a single point of contact, allowing for direct communication with member states authorities, the Commission, and the board. They have to be easily accessible by making public information concerning the point of contact. Then we also find rules applicable to providers of hosting services, including online platforms. So these actors must put notice and action mechanism in place to allow any individual or entity to notify the presence of illegal content on their service. And the mechanism must be easy to access, user-friendly by electronic means. We will then also find rules applicable to online platforms, but that exclude micro and small enterprises. So online platforms must provide the access to an effective internal complaint handling system. When is this system implemented? This system is implemented when online platforms take measures like removing access to the information or suspending or even terminating the recipient's account. Online platform must justify their measures. They have to be fair and ensure equity. And then we also find the interesting title of trusted flaggers. So trusted flaggers is given to an entity by the digital services coordinators. So who are trusted flaggers? Trusted flaggers are entities that have expertise to identify illegal content. They represent collective interests, and they are independent, submit notice in a timely, diligent, and objective manners. And because of their title as trusted flaggers, the notices submitted by them are to be preceded and decided upon with priority. Moving on, we find the text provides for measures and protection against misuse, like the duty to notify the law enforcement or judicial authorities of the member states concerned when they have a suspicion of criminal offense. Then we will find that the last provision of this section really focus on the importance of transparency. We also find additional obligations for very large online platform to manage systemic risk. So what is a very large online platform? So it is defined as an online platform which provide their services to a number of average monthly active recipients of the service in the European Union equal to or higher than 45 million. So these actors must identify, analyze, and assess once a year any significant systemic risk stemming for the use of their services in the European Union. The risk assessment must include the dissemination of illegal content through their services, any negative effects from the exercise of the fundamental rights, like private and family life, freedom of expression and information, and the intentional manipulation of their services, of their service with an actual or foreseeable negative effect on the protection of public health, minors, civic discourse, or electoral process and public security. When a very large online platform has identified systemic risk, it has to put in place reasonable, proportionate, and effective mitigation measures tailored for the specific risk. We will also find rules concerning due diligence obligation. So here the GSA implements standards, encourage adoption of code of conduct, the necessity to have specific code of conduct for online advertising, and the drawing up of crisis protocol. Then we're moving on to Chapter 4. Chapter 4 contains the provision concerning the implementation and enforcement of this regulation. So Section 1 lays down provision concerning national competent authorities, including digital services coordinators, which are the primary national authorities designed by the member states for the consistent application of this regulation. Then Section 2, focus on the European Board for Digital Services and their task. So what is their task? They have to be contributing, coordinating, and assisting digital services coordinators and the Commission with regard to matters covered by this regulation. Moving on to Section 3. Section 3 concerns the supervision, investigation, enforcement, and monitoring of very large online platforms. So here, actions go increasingly as well. They go from supervisions to fine. So here, investigation are really there to prevent the infringement, whereas fine and periodic payments are here to deter and take action, or else the infringement would continue. So the section also provides for the cooperation of the Commission with national courts. And then we find Section 4 that includes the common provision on enforcement. It first lays down rules on an information sharing system supporting communication between digital services coordinators, the Commission, and the Board. Then we will find in the last chapter, Chapter 5, so the final chapter provides information for the entry into force of this regulation. So now I will leave the floor to Emily.
Thank you, Marie. So regarding the different set of rules implemented by the GSA we just saw, we understand that it will strongly change the way companies offer and use digital services in the European Union. Indeed, the GSA affects not only large online gatekeeper platforms, as we will see later, but impacts the majority of digital service providers and their business users and customers. Still, we can wonder, what will be the relation between the GSA and the pre-existing rules in the field of e-commerce? So we will focus on this point. As we know, the objective of the GSA is to modernize and create a European uniform framework applicable in the different states of the European Union to regulate relations between the online intermediaries and their users. Actually, it aims to implement a safer digital space in which the fundamental rights of all users of digital services are protected, such as, for example, in the case of social networks, marketplaces, or other digital platforms. But in the same time, we are aware that issues relating to e-commerce are already dealt with, and especially by the e-commerce directive. Regarding this text, so that was adopted in 2000, and which provides a legal framework for the European market for online services, well, the European Commission is crystal clear. The GSA is without prejudice to the e-commerce directive. And actually, it builds on the provisions of the latter, in particular, the internal market principle set out in Article 3 of the e-commerce directive. Concerning the other rules, the spirit of the GSA is quite the same. So in its proposal, the European Commission explains that the GSA introduces a horizontal framework for all categories of content, projects, services, and activities on intermediary services. The high legal nature of such content, projects, or services is not defined by this regulation, so by the GSA, but actually results from union law or from national law in accordance with union law. As a consequence, it implies that the GSA is to complement existing sector-specific legislation. So, for example, it won't affect the application of existing EU laws that regulate certain aspects of the provision of information society services. So it's an example, as these rules will apply as lex specialis. By way of example, the obligations set out in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, also called the AVSMD, on video sharing platform providers, and more especially regarding audiovisual content and audiovisual commercial communications. So all these specific obligations will continue to apply. However, the GSA will find application to those providers to the extent that the AVSMD, so the specific regulation, do not contain more specific provisions applicable to them. We can also mention the General Data Protection Regulation and the other European rules on protection of personal data and privacy communication. Again, for instance, the GSA measures concerning advertising on online platforms will complement existing rules on consent and the right to object to processing of personal data, and absolutely won't modify them. So to put it in another way, well, the GSA is to fill the gaps of the existing European text. And to finish, well, we can also mention that the GSA will still be complementary to the e-platform to business regulation, so also called the P2B regulation, that became applicable in July 2020, and also to the directives that were adopted as part of the New Deal for consumers that will enter into force by May 2022. I thank you for your attention, and I leave the floor to Alexandre.
Hi everybody. So in this part, we will present you the Digital Market Act, which will be the new competition tools created by the European Commission. So firstly, to present the Digital Market Act, we can notice that a panel of economic experts from the Joint Research Center at the European Commission Science and Knowledge Services made a report in order to support the European policymaking process about the DMA. They established that they agree with the consensus that has emerged over the last years that existing ex-post competition and regulatory tools are insufficient to address the challenges of digital platforms for several reasons. So competition policy procedures are slow compared to the pace of change in the digital economy. Remedies may be insufficient and outdated to deal with the challenges, and it is difficult to unscramble the eggs and restore competition once harm is done. So the Digital Market Act is an European reform that should be adopted in the next month. It should implement rules in order to control and regulate companies which act as gatekeeper in the digital sector. The GMA should prevent those gatekeepers from imposing unfair conditions on businesses and consumers, and also to ensure the openness of main digital services. So the proposal for the GMA is divided into 6 chapters. So there are the subjects, firstly the subject, after the definition of gatekeeper, after the practice, who is with contestable, with unfair from the gatekeeper. After there are the market investigation, and after some general provision. So now I will present you the concept of gatekeeper in the DMA. So the gatekeeper can be defined following the elements given by the Commission. So firstly, it can be a company which has a strong economic position and a significant impact on the internal market and is active in multiple Europe countries. Secondly, it can be a company who has a strong intermediation position, meaning that it links a large user base to a large number of businesses. Or finally, the gatekeeper can be the company which has untrusted and durable position in the market, meaning that it is stable over the time. So after this definition of gatekeeper, we should determine which company are concerned, and the Commission has given 3 criteria. So the first criteria is the size of the company. So to be concerned by this notion of gatekeeper, the annual turnover in the European economic area should be equal or above 6.5 billion in the last 3 financial years. Or secondly, the average market capitalization or equivalent fair market value amounted to at least 65 billion in the last financial year. So that was the first criteria. The second one is if the company should have the control of an important gateway from businesses and user towards final consumer. If the company, for example, operates a core platform services with more than 45 million monthly active users established or located in Europe, or if the company are more than 10,000 yearly active businesses user established in Europe. And to finish with the criteria, the company should have an entrusted and durable position. And for example, if this criteria is presumed, if the company met the other 2 first criteria of the size and the number of users in the last 3 years. So we can notice that currently companies such as Amazon, Google, or even Facebook can be considered as gatekeepers on their market. So the consequences of the GMA will be to impose extra responsibility to act in a way that ensures an open online environment that is fair for businesses and consumers. Also, the GMA works on the basis of do and don't action. For instance, with the do action, we can quote that the company will have to ensure interoperability with their services for third-party company, including ancillary services, ensure portability of user or businesses partner data generated on the platform. Secondly, the do action is when the company will allow user companies to promote their offerings and enter into contracts with their customer outside their platform. And thirdly, it can be the case when they should provide companies that advertise on their platform with the tools and information necessary for advertiser and publisher to conduct their own independent verification of advertisements hosted by them. Now about the do not action, we can notice the fact that company, on the contrary, will have to avoid giving the services and products they offer more favorable treatments in terms of ranking, for example, than similar services and products offered by third party on their platform. We can notice, however, that company should avoid the use of data generated by a business's partner on their platform to compete with them. Also cross-references core platform data with its other services of third party. And finally, they will have to prevent users from uninstalling pre-installed software or application they wish. So I leave the floor to Charlotte for the end of the part of the presentation.
So thank you really much, Alex. So now I'm going to introduce you to the legal and institutional mechanism expected to for the DMA. So basically, in competition procedure, in order to really understand if a company is in a dominant position and if she's abusing of it, there is a 3-step competition policy procedure. So firstly, we're going to delineate the relevant markets. Then we're going to assess if the firm is in a dominant position by assessing her market power. And then finally, see if she's abusing of this dominant position. And so we're going to design then, if necessary, appropriate remedies. So this procedure can be really inadequate on the field of digital platforms. So the DMA opts for a one-step procedure, which avoids the above steps. So considering how difficult is it to define the relevant markets in the digital space, we really want to believe that the DMA proposed criteria really provide a good start. For example, Article 3 of the DMA allows for the possibility of identifying a gatekeeper based on a variety of more qualitative factors, such as, for example, entry barriers from network effects and data advantages. So the Commission will be the body which enforces the DMA, and new power will be provided to the Commission, including surveys. So those surveys will be used in order to, first, identify those who might be gatekeepers, then second, investigate when a gatekeeper systematically violates his obligation and therefore propose the most appropriate measures, and then to determine whether other services in the digital sector should be added to the list of essential platform services covered by the regulation, or whether new practices have emerged which may have the same harmful effect as those already covered. So when the DMA will be in force, the following procedure will have to be followed. So first, company will have to determine if they be considered as gatekeeper. So this action is really based on this logic of autonomy and self-judging principle. So if the company found out that she can be considered as a gatekeeper, she then will have to notify the status to the Commission. Then the Commission in a second position will investigate and then decide if they could enter in the criteria set up in the DMA. And then finally, if the Commission ends up at the same conclusion than the company that they enter in the DMA criteria, within 6 months, the company will have to comply with the do and don't operations. So what are the sanctions if a gatekeeper doesn't comply with his obligation under the DMA? So if a company doesn't comply with their obligation, she could face diverse sanctions imposed by the Commission. So first, as you can see, there can be fine of up to 10% of the company's total worldwide annual turnover. Then there could also be periodic penalty payment up to 5% of the company's total worldwide annual turnover, on also pecuniary penalties, or even if there are systematic infringements from the company, there could be also additional remedies, for example, structural remedies, such as obliging a gatekeeper to sell a business or part of it, and also behavioral remedies. So then there is finally this part where direct actions in national courts for consumers who suffered from a company non-compliance to the DMA will be possible. So finally, there are some questions that we would like to ask to Mr. Podszun. So in your opinion, how the do and don't method is the most effective one in this case with the digital platform? And are there other methods that you have been thinking of when you were writing your report? Then do you think that the sanction in case of non-compliance, with the sanction related to annual turnover or this kind of thing, are going to be enough dissuasive? And then finally, will the DMA will be enough to establish a fair competition in consideration of the major technological developments in terms of algorithm based on a huge collection of personal data? And would making this new technologies public a potential solution? So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm going now to leave the floor to Elise to present you the alternative of the DMA and the DSA.
Hello. So digital platforms obviously challenge the law and the definition they were giving up until now. Each country tried to adapt differently, and we will see some of the major solutions they came up with. We will first discuss about the position of the USA to see the alternative to the European measures. Then we will talk about the CMA alternatives, and finally we will have a brief comparison in different countries and models. So Biden, 2 months into his presidency, set a cap for the new American approach of the tech sector. He appointed in his administration Lina Khan and Tim Wu, who will expose to you their point of view on how to enforce antitrust laws and find other ways to regulate the big tech. Those two are eminent advocates for more direct and aggressive methods, By appointing them, we can see that Joe Biden has decided to take a different direction from the one he took under Obama's presidency and decided to take a firm stand against antitrust abuses. We can expect that Joe Biden will go even further than Donald Trump, who mostly focused on the First Amendment and the freedom of speech and addressed the deeper problem. As we said, the plan is already in motion. The GAFAs are under scrutiny with a recent legal procedure against Google and many interrogations being discussed by the American government. By appointing Lina Khan and Timu, we can expect that we will see new laws and measures being applied soon. So about Lina Khan, she exposes to us two distinct approaches. Either we want to govern the online platform market through competition, and she recommends states to reform antitrust law to prevent this dominance from emerging. It could involve making the law against predatory pricing more powerful by establishing a presumption of predation for dominant platforms found to be pricing below cost. This presumption would involve identifying when a price is below cost. The price are then not a complete method, since a lot of platforms are free, like Facebook, for example. So since the price is not enough, there's a second approach. We can also accept that these platforms' markets are monopolistic or oligopolistic, thus should be regulated to take advantage of the economy of scale while nurturing the firm's ability to exploit its dominance. A way to implement this would be to apply the essential facilities doctrine that imposes sharing requirements on a natural monopoly asset that serves as a necessary input in another market. It rests on two basic premises. First, a natural monopolist in one market should not be permitted to deny access to the critical facility to foreclose rivals in adjacent markets. And then second, the more radical remedy of dividing the facility among multiple owners while mitigating the threat of monopoly leveraging could sacrifice important efficiencies. So pursuing this regime for online platforms could maintain the benefits of scale while preventing dominant players from abusing their power. Timu worked on the neo-Brandeisian agenda that aimed for an enforcement of the antitrust law. The Brandeis School and Justice Louis Brandeis himself was a proponent of sector-specific regulation to enhance competition and protect consumers. To explain a bit about it, first about the democratization of the merger. This process is quasi-judicial, administrative, and should be known more by the public, so the users know what are the consequences of the merger. Big mergers are political in a sense that they interest and influence politics, so they should be known at least by the public. About breakups, there is a tendency to portray breakups and dissolution as off the table or only for extreme cases, but the original practice favored dissolution as the default remedy. Furthermore, breakups aren't as impossible as one might think. It wouldn't be unthinkable to undo the merger of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, for example. While Facebook wouldn't like it and not welcome the new competition, there is no great social cost here. It could even lead to reinstate the protection of privacy through competition. Then another point of the theory is the antitrust goal. Consumer welfare shouldn't be the sole goal of antitrust. It is not to be abandoned, but it's too narrow of a goal. You can measure the consumer welfare when dealing with highly complex transactions. The judges, which are a legal entity, are far more suited to determine if the situation will promote or prevent competition and then act accordingly. So the protection of competition standards has advantages of a much greater support from congressional intent. So thank you, and I'm leaving the floor to Margot for the TMA.
Thank you, Elise. So with Brexit, United Kingdom and European Union are competing to demonstrate their competencies in the field of innovation and consumers protection. On November the 27th of 2020, so way before the publication of the proposed Digital Market Act, United Kingdom has announced its intention to create a digital market unit to regulate the digital sectors. It appears intended to capture the big social media and search platforms that are considered as gatekeepers. So firstly, it was decided that no new body would be created in order to regulate digital platforms, but rather that the Competition Market Authority will have greater and broader powers to regulate them. They will therefore have more prerogatives that will allow it to have greater control to monitor those platforms. And they have chosen to use their existing tools in the most efficient way and the most effective way possible
in order to solve the problems posed by the digital economy. Therefore, they will have to adapt those current tools, working with the government in order to meet the digital challenges. And although there are no new body created, a new service has emerged from the reform. It is a digital market unit that will be housed within the Competition Market Authority. And they will work alongside those regulators, and they should have the capacity, expertise, and funding to carry out its functions successfully. They will enforce the new rules with both investigative and sanctioning powers. The sanction could go up to 10% of the global turnover of the undertakings, and the decisions as well as their penalties would not be subject to merits review, but only appealable to a judicial review standard. If we could try to sum up the objectives of the digital market unit, it would be firstly to use open data as a tool to encourage competition, where it is both necessary and proportionate to achieve its objectives. They will also have to cooperate with a wide range of stakeholders while having powers to impose remedies and to control, investigate, and eventually sanction breaches of the rules. Finally, they will also have to establish a code of conduct and impose measures for digital platforms that have been designated as having strategic market status. The notion of strategic market status is a new regime that has been created in order to have a better control on large tech firms, and that should apply to those most powerful firms. Concretely, in order to establish whether a firm falls within the scope of the strategic market status, a test based on a two-step assessment will be conducted. First, they will have to determine whether the firm has entrenched market power in at least one digital activity, and secondly, whether these powers provide them with a strategic position. The Competition Market Authority has opted for a more anti-regulation with an unforeseeable code of conduct for firms with strategic market status designation. The code of conduct would only apply to the specific SMS designated activities, and it will consist of both objectives and principle and guidance. The objectives are set in legislation. We can count among them fair trading, open choices, and trust and transparency. And those objectives are supported by principles and guidance that are determined by the digital market unit in consultation with third parties based on the circumstances of each cases. Finally, special major control rules have been created, still in the idea of having a better control and regulation of the platforms, and it will require mandatory notification from those platforms for any acquisition, and it will apply a lower threshold than a dominant market position under the existing British competition law for international phase 2. Unlike the code of conduct, the major control rules for strategic market status firms would only apply to the firm as a whole and not just the strategic market status designated activities. So that's the approach that the British government has taken, but we could think of other alternatives, and I will leave Ines to explain them to you.
Hi. So now it seems most timely to consider emerging powers, especially in a view of recent events, and in particular with regard to China. Indeed, on last April 10, the State Administration for Market Regulation of China financially sanctioned Alibaba for abuse of dominant position. In addition, in order to ensure that a better transparency, various more incentive-based recommendations were issued, notably based on compliance, transparency, and cooperation. These guiding principles are being implemented, first of all, its own national digital giants. And the aforementioned sanction was taken on the basis of a new regulation which not only extended the rules to digital platforms, but also broadened the definition of abuse of dominant positions. Companies' ability to collect and process data has been added to the criteria, as well as the scale of our internet operation and first mover advantage. China has blocked most of the services provided by Google, Facebook, or any other media groups. And besides Alibaba and Tencent, China has produced its own internet search leader, Baidu, as well as second-ranked e-commerce group, JD.com. Dropped at the end of November 2020. And on February 7, 2021, China State Administration for Market Regulation promulgated the antitrust guideline for the platform economy with immediate effect. This guideline expressly referred to the anti-monopoly law currently under revision and set principles and rules to discipline the online market in compliance with the provision already stated under the anti-monopoly law. And the main goal of the guideline is to prevent monopolistic behaviors and to create a fair and competitive market on online platforms and to safeguard consumer interests. So a similar situation can also be echoed in Russia, because the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service, with the fifth monopoly package, as within the framework of its law on the protection of competition, specifically targeted digital platforms by adding digital provision. An additional criteria to the law on protection of competition law that allowed to designate owners of digital platforms as dominant players if dominant players of a digital platform as a share of more than 45% in the market of substitute services delivered using digital platforms related to ensuring interaction between economic entities. And the rule stating that the owner of a digital platform or several similar digital platforms whose revenues for the last calendar year did not exceed 400 million rubles. Finally, the creation and development of a new web service to identify cartels, Big Digital Cat Web Service. It's an automated program to identify and prove cartels. It will be used to control actions and expose anti-competitive agreements. The program will work particularly in the basis of the procurement information system and other data sources, mass media, e-trading sites, open information sources. Compared to other emerging countries, there is a use of a sort of industrial strategy and promoting a kind of protectionism with the aim of creating a national champion who will be supported by the state in order to guarantee effective competition. And this can be seen particularly near South Africa. Indeed, South Africa needs a cross-cutting national digital strategy that includes an investment strategy to get a sectoral approach in each sector. And in this regard, the industrial policy must facilitate investment in digital infrastructure, skills development, and digital firms. Also, it could be taken into account the fact of stimulating investment in local enterprise development by creating a conducive regulatory framework for digital firms and by undertaking active support measures, which may include establishing technology or innovation hubs and incubators. A role could be devoted to policymakers to provide subsidies or indirect support to local firms that are innovative or use existing products and services that can be incrementally improved and help them compete in the global market. It's also considered of using emerging technologies to boost the governance of public procurement, such as algorithmic trading softwares. Another proposed solution in particular, considering in certain African countries, there is a kind of digital protectionism. Indeed, Africa, there has been a significant increase in the digital market, then in full expansion, and as in any emerging market, there is a form of protectionism to protect startups. And now, finally, we could also talk about international cooperation, because international cooperation is more and more needed, and it's been amplified with the advent of digital platforms, which appear as transnational tools with wide and significant effects. And strengthen this international cooperation, which can be seen in particular with regard to the BRICS, the latter promoting a trend towards harmonization, which at the same time contributes to making international cooperation effective. And how could we succeed? First, it could be considered of creating a new institution. It will be easier to negotiate with states that are not members of the international competition network, like for example, and especially regarding China and Russia, which have important antitrust systems. And instead of the fact they don't play an important role in international regulation, moreover, it could be allowed to involve countries that are not part of it. Also spreading the mandate of the International Competition Network. One of the most important issues about the International Competition Network is that it has not any power to ensure an efficient regulation because of its rules deprived of effects. So it can't bound the states to respect this one. For example, if a member doesn't respect its practices with regard to merger notification and review, the International Competition Network could be given the power to sanction the states. Moreover, a dispute resolution system similar to that in place in the World Trade Organization should be built in order to have a fair and effective procedure regarding sanctions. So thank you for listening us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ines, and thank you the other students. Well, Rupert, you have a lot of questions to answer now. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David, and thanks to all the students in particular for bringing up these these impressive presentations. That's really great. And I wish my German students would have heard you to take your example and be inspired by that. So thank you very much for that. I also since I take the floor now, just let me thank you again, David, for inviting me, for having me. Also great to see Frédéric and others in the room, and so happy to be in Aix, if only virtually, and hopefully next year face à face en cours Mirabeau, and hopefully we get that done some other time. Wow, this was a lot of input, and I can only compliment you on the ideas and points you made. Let me try to structure the picture a bit in maybe 4 or 5 questions that I take, and these questions are essentially why, who, what, and how. I think that's 4. Let me try to deal with the matters in these 4 sections, and I try to sort of give some answers to what you said, some questions, some remarks. And let me start with Gaspard and Jean-Romain on the question, why do we do this? And you have sort of very neatly set out the origins, the purpose of the things we are discussing now, the DMA, the DSA, and other initiatives. And I always find it very important to remember really, why are we doing this exercise in the first place? And you mentioned very rightly so, this is about sort of moving into the ex-ante regulation field. And the main thing that we, in my view, need now is speeding up procedures. So a lot of what we are doing now is about speed, the speed of intervening in the market. Because as you said, we have the Google shopping case, for instance, which now is in its 10th year. So we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Google shopping case without having a final outcome. And because the courts are still ruling on that. And we have also seen that the remedies, particularly in the Google search shopping case, are very difficult to implement in the markets. We haven't really seen any big market changes after the case came out. We are experiencing a very similar thing with the German Facebook case that you may have heard about, which sort of relates to the merger case of Facebook WhatsApp that you mentioned. And so I think that we always need to be clear, okay, this is essentially about speeding up procedures. We are moving from the field of competition, where we have all these sort of great ideas of weighing, of looking at efficiencies, of market definition, etc. And we are now sort of doing it differently because we have seen we are coming to our limits. We are stretching the limits of competition law, and it all takes too long. But there is another aspect. And I think, Ines, you sort of hinted at that when talking about Africa and the situation in Africa, and I found that very illuminating, sort of to have that comparison in the very end. And the point is, we are not just doing this for promoting competition, which is for people like David, Frédéric, and me, and all others in the room. I mean, we are advocates of free competition, etc. But I think that the debate here is much larger than that. This is no longer just about competition. It is about taking control. It is about the question, who gets the share of what in the economy, who profits the most, it is probably also about democracy, who is able to control the flow of information, who is able to control what we think, what we do, what we read, etc. So there are a lot of questions attached to that that go far beyond competition. And Ines, you spoke about the African perspective, where the discussion is also raging about digital platforms, but probably much more with a view to other goals. So how can we promote a stable economic environment? How can people participate, etc. And in the EU debate, I mean, if you discuss with politicians, what they want to know is, does that help our European firms? Right? So it is not just about our free competition thing, but there are all sorts of other motives. And you may think of the, now we are in a German-French sort of exchange here, you may think of the European champions debate that we had when the European Commission, Margrethe Vestager, banned the merger of Siemens and Alstom, which sort of gave this whole debate sort of a big push in with the German and the French ministers stepping forward. David, please help me. I elect the name of the French Minister of Economics now.
Bruno Le Maire.
Bruno Le Maire, exactly. I mean, he's an impressive figure, and he pushed that idea of saying, this is not about competition. We need strong European champions. And the German politicians also sort of went into that vein. And I think this is also in the debate on DMA and DSA and other tools to think, okay, does it hurt our European companies, or does it hurt the American companies, or does it restrain the American companies? And Elise, you have spoken about the US, and I find that incredibly interesting that the United States are now in a position to say, we restrain our own national champions. I mean, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, those are the companies driving growth in the US. And now Joe Biden and his administration step in, and even Donald Trump has done that before. I don't want to say a good word on Donald Trump, but he did it. He started to restrain these companies, and they are going against their own national champions. I doubt that we would see a Digital Markets Act if it was a French and a German Google or Facebook around. So we should keep that in mind when discussing US policies as well. They're really going against their own national champions. So regarding the question, why do we do this? I think that we always have to keep in mind, the first thing is, we need to speed up procedures in competition law. We are not able to do that in competition law, so we move into the field of regulation. And the second thing is, this is not just about competition law, this is about fairness, about democracy, about promoting our own digital environment, etc., etc. Whenever I discuss this, let me add this point. Whenever I discuss this with politicians on the European level or with other stakeholders, I tend to say, look, we are just little lawyers, right? We are doing our laws, etc. But our laws won't change the world in the digital arena. If you really want to change the digital world, please step up education, step up digital technology in Europe. Give all of us a great internet access. This is not the case in Germany, I can tell you, and do a lot of things on the economic and technological and also on science and education sphere. That's probably more important than setting new rules. But that's sort of a side aspect. They don't want to listen to that. They don't like that point. They say, you're a lawyer, please tell us how we can restrain the big companies and how that helps our companies. But keep that in mind, that this is one of the motivations of all these things, because it explains a bit. Gaspar and Jean-Romain, you had asked about the move to ex-ante regulation. I think that the better distinctive point is not so much ex-post or ex-ante, but rules and standards. So what we have at present in Article 102, for instance, is we have a very general clause, which is difficult to apply because we have all these efficiencies coming in and we have to look at all these factors, as you mentioned. And now we sort of move into the field of having very narrow rules where we don't have to fight that much. So I would prefer not to see it as sort of ex-ante or ex-post enforcement. It's, in my view, it's much more about, do we talk about broad standards, or do we talk about narrow rules that are more easy to enforce? And yes, if we move into that field of regulation, we restrain the power of these companies, or we take their room to maneuver. But I think I mean, we can discuss that for ages, but I guess that we are at a point where at least I would say, yes, we need to do that. There is a good case that I would argue for, that we need to have some blocking here and there. Now, moving to the second point, the question of who. And I think that Marie discussed this for the Digital Services Act, Alexandre for the Digital Markets Act. And that is an essential question. Whom do we actually wish to target? And one of the failures of this debate, in my view, is that we are always looking at the GAFAs, at the big 4 or 5 companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. And we are not so much discussing what is beyond that. And we have seen a lot of cases involving Booking.com, for instance, the hotel booking platform. And I think that is also a matter of, I mean, for debate in France, with so many hotels and many spots that are worth a visit. So their tourism, etc., play a big role. So Booking.com is very important for this field, but it's not the same as Google, Amazon, Facebook. So do we wish to regulate Booking in the same way we wish to regulate Google or Amazon, where most people will agree, yes, they need some taming, but sort of the difficult and the interesting discussion starts beyond these 5 GAFA companies. Booking is one example. Spotify is another example. I mean, Spotify, as if you've read the news these days, Spotify is complaining against Apple because they feel discriminated against in the App Store, probably rightly so. But Spotify is a European company, a Swedish bred company. And second, they are also a big platform and a big player in music and entertainment. So it's sort of, what kind of restriction do they need? Are they one of the companies addressed by the Digital Markets Act? Are they one of the very large companies addressed by the Digital Services Act? I think that merits a lot of discussion, and we don't have that discussion so much because we are always focusing on these other firms. There's also taking up a point that Ines made regarding China. I think we also should always have a look on to the gatekeepers coming from China. Maybe they are not that strong in France, they're not that strong in Germany at present, but they have the technological capacity, and they are sort of maneuvering into a position where they can possibly enter the European markets as well. And as Ines has pointed out, they are now under scrutiny in China, where the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, tries to take control in a way. So that's also discussing the question who is addressed. That's probably also meriting a lot of that's also an interesting question to look at. What actually is our position towards these Chinese companies? Now, if I look at the discussion that Alexandre and Marie sort of put up with, or whom do we wish to address? Let me address one feature, and I'm going to recur to that later when I'm discussing the how. And that's the question, how do we identify these companies? And just today, before joining you here, I had a discussion with 2 people from the EU Commission, and they are also now sort of discussing how do we identify the digital gatekeepers. And there are essentially 2 models. The one is we take more qualitative criteria. So is that a core platform service? Is it a very strong company with certain features? Or do we take purely quantitative criteria? You need to have that and that number of users, etc. You have actually presented the figures in your presentation that are needed for being a very large gatekeeper in the DSA or a digital gatekeeper in the DMA. So and the question is, can we really go for quantitative criteria? Can we really say if you have 65 million whatever users or daily active this and that, is that a good sort of filter for going into regulation? And this is a question where we exactly are at this point. Do we want it quick and dirty, right? An easy solution with fixed numbers, or do we want it very exactly with a very great sort of care put into it, but probably taking a lot of time? And if you go the second way, you always have to keep in mind that the companies we are discussing are companies employing absolutely top lawyers with enormous resources. So people like you after your graduation, right? You go into the big law firms in Paris and Brussels, and you are then fighting your case for Google. And then there are these enforcers in the European Commission trying to fend off your case. And that's much easier if you have exact numbers than as if you have to argue on a term, are you a core platform service? So this is a debate that we have to keep in mind that is important on the addressing of who. And the point in this here is that in my view, we have to keep, as lawyers, we have to keep proportionality in mind. So we have to sort of see, okay, fixed numbers are problematic, but on the other hand, in merger control, we are working with such fixed numbers, turnover numbers. So we are sort of used to this filter. Let me move to the point of what do we essentially want? So what are the obligations? You haven't discussed that in detail today, but it's sort of behind everything. And Charlotte and Emilie have spoken about that on DMA and DSA respectively. I think Gaspard, Jean-Romain, they mentioned the self-preferencing of Google as an example of what are the obligations. And thanks for mentioning in the very beginning. I felt very honored by what you said. My sort of key ideas that I tried to put forward in the paper, and that is sort of put down to three bigger obligations, namely keeping markets open, trying to keep markets contestable. Secondly, the freedom of information or the non-bias of information that I would largely see, or promoting fairness, which in part is providing fair and good information, and partly which is not to have asymmetries that are based on principal agent problems. So there's someone controlling your flow of information, telling you this is what there is, etc. I think we see that perfectly with Amazon and Google. That is the second point. So information and asymmetries that we need to sort of get into balance. And the third point, ensuring the sovereignty of economic decision makers or economic actors. And you may translate that into consumer sovereignty or consumer choice. And let me just say one word on this last aspect, because the first two aspects are very well known to us under competition. I mean, we want open markets for sure. That's very difficult if you have these strong network effects that Gaspard discussed in the beginning. But we need to ensure that that's our prime aim. The other aspect of trying to avoid biases in information, in the flow of information, and trying to deal with the asymmetries of these companies, I think that's a very fair point and something that is also often looked at. But this third point, getting consumers back in the driving seat, taking control of your own economic decisions, I think that is something that is, at least if I speak from a German perspective, very strongly entrenched in our idea of civil law, but it's not so much at the forefront of economic regulation so far. And that's some sort of discrepancy that I find very interesting, in the sense that I think, I mean, if I come from that whole idea of enlightenment with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, Immanuel Kant, etc., I mean, if this is our guiding idea of European values, I don't know, David, whether you have a picture of Jean-Jacques Rousseau on your table or so. I imagine French law professors to have that. I don't know, but maybe I'm mistaken. Every German law professor has his Immanuel Kant somewhere bust on his table at least. So if you have this idea of taking autonomous decisions, you are the sovereign of your own ideas, you are the one taking the decisions for yourself, then we need to ensure that in our economic dealings as well. I don't want to be told by Amazon what I have to do or what I have to buy, or only get the information that Amazon sees fit for me, right? And that's part of my personality. And interestingly, in the German Facebook case, the German Federal Supreme Court, the Bundesgerichtshof, has said exactly that in this case, taking it from the constitutional values in Germany, saying your right to self-determination needs to be ensured, and that also goes into competition law. That's very, very sort of revolutionary for a competition lawyer, because I mean, I always learned competition law is about economics and that's about it. I never looked into the constitution when doing competition law. Now I learned that we have to respect the constitution even as economic lawyers, as people doing droit, économique. So there is something about that in our constitutional values. And I find that a fascinating thing. I don't want to take that too far, because I think that it can also lead to some sort of very difficult situations. But if we look into the different obligations, be it in the DSA or in the DMA, I think we always have to keep these three positions in mind. And essentially that also means that with great power comes great responsibility. With great power comes liability, comes and a need for transparency. Do I still have 5 minutes?
Sure.
Okay, sorry, I lost track of the time. Let me say one word on what are we essentially talking about. And what I find interesting, the longer I think about it, is that maybe I cannot explain it in a good way, but maybe you get an idea of what I mean, is that essentially what these platforms are so good at is that they are processing information. I mean, we're always discussing the data economy, and data essentially means information. And now sort of they are brokering information. That's essentially what they're doing. And they are perfect at that. I mean, there is no better information handler than Google. I mean, imagine, okay, you students, you are too young, but I grew up in a time where information was not that easily accessible. And now there is a perfectly programmed, greatly designed website that delivers me every information in the whole world at the click of my fingertips. And that's something so incredible that I'm still stunned by how they do that. And it brings them enormous power. And this enormous power is essentially what this is about, namely handling information. And my personal sort of, I'm mentioning this now, since my personal sort of grip on the whole issue moved away from data and information in the meantime. So I thought this is no longer, so we started a couple of years ago when we started discussing all these topics. We started, this is the new data economy and data is the new oil, etc., etc. And then we sort of, or I personally moved away from that and thought this is not about data, this is about everything, and this is the whole economy, etc. And now sort of the longer I think about it, I'm back at thinking about the point, no, this is essentially about how we distribute, how do we control information in society. And it becomes, and sort of I'm doing a learning experience here in the sense of I'm trying to move back into information economics a bit and into looking how information is dispersed, how it is created, how it, etc. And I think we see that very easily in the Australian developments of the past months. You may remember that newspapers and Facebook and Google fight with the Australian government, or the turning point, in my view, at the beginning of this year, when Twitter and Facebook said Donald Trump may no longer give his information on our accounts. And in this moment, I think that all politicians in the world suddenly sense something has to change. It cannot be that Facebook decides who gets out, who gets an audience. I don't think that the case is very good in this. I see there is a strong case of putting Donald Trump off Facebook and off Twitter, and I'm so grateful they did that. But I think that that's still sort of from the information and economics perspective, that's a very interesting turning point that I am not yet sort of fully, you noticed, I don't know the answer yet exactly what that means to me, but I have the feeling that we need to look again into what does all this mean, that all economic business transactions, etc., are only information now. So I try to get back to that point in my thinking now and encourage you to think about this as it's the information age. All these slogans that we heard 10 or 15 years ago, they are true. And I'm relearning that they are truer probably than I had thought. Now to the final point that I wanted to make, the how. And many of your thoughts in the presentation dealt with the question, how do we do that? What is sort of the techniques? And that's exactly right to focus on that. I think Emilie, Charlotte, Elise, Margot, and Ines, they focused very strongly on these issues. And that's right, because we are lawyers in the end. We are the ones where people want to know, okay, how do we do that? What's sort of the right rule, etc. All the other aspects that we've discussed about now are societal aspects, social aspects, economic aspects, where people can engage in the discussion as we as citizens and others as experts as well. But as lawyers, we are essentially there to tell people this is how you do it. And I found it really illuminating and very interesting how you presented the different mechanisms, the different regimes in the UK, in China, in the US, in Russia, in Africa. I could add the German perspective, which is still a bit different with the new competition tool that we have there, Section 19A. But I spare you just that, because I just sort of want to highlight a couple of features that I find interesting in this debate. How do we approach this as lawyers? And one thing, if we look at this, and maybe starting with the presentation by Emilie and Marie on the DSA, you discussed, for instance, that there is an interplay with other rules, e-commerce directive, P2B directive, etc., new deal for consumers. And I think that one important mission and message that we have to give to people is there is no one silver bullet that we can fire and everything is fine. That's not the case in the law. Typically, if you have a problem or if you have a situation, a complex situation like this one, you will have to deal with 1,000 rules and laws at a time. And you can only hope that this is somewhat consistent with other stuff. I learned that one day when we looked into a proposal for unfair terms in the agricultural business. You know that there are rules on that. And we did a comment a couple of years ago when this came up for the first time, and we presented our comments to an EU official. And one of our comments was, we have so many rules on unfair commercial practices. Now you come up with unfair commercial practices for the agricultural sector. Why can't we do all this in a nice, concise, consistent way and a great act that deals with all that? And this guy from the EU Commission said, we can't. It's impossible. We cannot sort of do this master plan, masterpiece of legislation. It simply doesn't work. We are here in this unit. We are dealing with this directive, and we hope that we don't sort of step on everyone else's toe. And that makes law so complicated, actually. I mean, you probably have noticed when presenting and when preparing, there are so many rules already, and this is all so complicated. And then there is a whole other realm of rules that we need to deal with. And then there's a UK regime and Chinese and then etc. But this is how it is. We need to deal with very many different things, because this is about all sorts of aspects of our life. And one of you mentioned taxation, for instance. I mean, of course, the GAFA companies have a tax issue, sort of, or we could at least believe that. So we need to deal with tax issues. We need to deal with the liability issues. We need to deal with the competition issues, etc. So that's the one thing. I think we don't have to strive for consistency. We just have to deal with the matters at hand. There's no other solution to that. The second point that I find very important, that I've learned a lot about in the past months, is in European law, it very strongly clings on the legal basis that you choose to have a European act. So if you put the DMA and the DSA on the footing of Article 114 of the treaty, you are in the field of harmonizing rules for the internal market. If you want to do a competition law tool, you have to take another legal basis for that. That's 103 TFEU, which is completely different, with different system, etc. And you always have to be aware that one day a court comes and checks on whether you took the right legal basis for your tools. But if you are in 114, if you are in this harmonization thing, you have to follow the path that is laid out there. And there are certain specific logics and rationales, etc., restrictions that you have to follow. And that's important, sort of. I think that's something that the EU Commission grapples with at present, where they really have problems, because they essentially want to do something in competition, but they use another legal basis for that, now have to bring in other stuff. And that sort of goes beyond their system. So that's something important that I wasn't that aware of when we started this discussion, how important that is to choose the right legal basis for what we are doing. And that's really purely legal stuff, where we are really confronted with, okay, reading judgments by the European Court of Justice. What do they say on Deutsche Post? What do they say on bpost, etc. in cases where this problem came up in the past? Then the third point, you have probably already noticed, I'm a big fan of intervention. I want to tame the tech titans, right? But on the other hand, we are still in a legal regime. And I found it good to say, to bring in the Chinese perspective, Ines, because when we are discussing China, I always have a certain reservation that maybe they do not respect the rule of law in the same way as I would love to see it. I'm not sure, I can't say. I'm not an expert on Chinese law, but there's always sort of a danger that politics takes over. And that's the same here. And we can, I really don't want to, I really want to see a new sort of digital regulation in place, but we still have to respect that even Facebook, Google, Amazon, and others have some legal rights, right? So they can go to court. We need to stick to the rule of law. We need to give them the right to be heard. We need to respect the proportionality principle. We need to put our rules on the right footings, etc. Let's not forget that in our, or in my, I don't know your personal positions on that, but let's not forget that when we sort of discuss these issues, that we are lawyers, that all this is bound to the rule of law, and that there is one thing that is even worse than Google being world dominant, namely us losing the rule of law. And that's sort of an important warning. And that means that in the field of sanctions that, that some of you have talked about, is particularly in the field of sanctions, that we really need to respect our principles of the rule of law. We need to give them the right to be heard, the right to sue, etc., etc., etc. That's an important point that I just wanted to make. Now, finally, maybe on this, or finally, but one point, you have pointed at the different ways of how we do that. And what helped me in looking at these features is look at substantive material rules and look at formal procedural rules. And all these rules have to be brought into balance somehow. So there are very different issues that you can where you can sort of put your finger on. You can be very tough on choosing gatekeepers and putting enormous obligations on them. But if you don't have a good enforcement system, and if you cannot enforce that, it doesn't help at all, right? So enforcement needs to be tough and smart. Otherwise, all substantial rules don't help anything. And you can now sort of play with the system. And I find that very interesting to see now in the debate on the DMA, how companies start lobbying, etc. So do we get out of this whole system by we are not gatekeepers? So the filter function, the definition in the beginning, or do we want rather lax material rules, or do we want lax enforcement? Right? And you can balance all that, and you have to put the balance on that. If you look into unfair commercial practices, just to give an example from another field of the law, in unfair commercial practices, we have very strict rules, we have no efficiency defense, we have a general clause that is very wide, but the sanctions at present, this is changing now, but the sanctions at present are still sort of okay-ish for companies. If they violate the unfair commercial practices directive or the national implementation of that, sanctions are not like overwhelming. It's not like stopping them from doing business. Maybe they pay a fine. In Germany, they don't even pay a fine. They are just stopped from doing their behavior. So, okay, right? This is individual cases. You do something wrong in a small case. Okay, you stop your behavior after a court battle. Now in the DMA, some of the provisions or structural separation, a breakup, that's enormous. That's really stopping you from doing business. That's driving you out of a field of business completely. That's completely different. And so your formal and procedural obligations have to be tougher, right? And you can sort of try to find the balance and have to always to see the trade-off there. And my perspective on the DMA, at least, I'm not so sure about the DSA, is that enforcement in the DMA at present is still not as good as it needs to be if we really want to see substantial change. finally, 2 points. The one is, let's not forget the courts. The courts have the final say on this. They need to have the final say on this. And we probably, from an institutional perspective, need to see how do we get the courts into a sort of more modern move, right? Some courts, I'm speaking about Germany now, I could never speak about France, and I rather not speak about Europe, but since we don't know that much about the European courts in this debate yet, but the German courts are much more conservative than the agencies, and I wonder how that plays out in practice at a later stage. And the final, very final point now, you know that this is a moving debate, and I find it great that you looked into this, and I can only encourage you to stay in that debate, because we are essentially devising your use of information and of these digital tools. I mean, David, Frederic, and me, we are still using paper, right? I do, sorry, you are probably more modern than I am. Okay, so, but you are working in the digital field, and this will sort of shape your generations dealing with that. So please give us the input, and not just us, but engage in this debate and step forward with your ideas and your knowledge on this. And I can only encourage you in this, and I'm very sort of happy to have seen your presentations today, because I have the feeling that you have a good grip on the topic, and so I would wish you sort of to be tough on that debate too. That's it for now. Thank you, David and Frederic and everyone.
Thank you very much, Ruprecht. Thank you very much. Thank you for this presentation. Your point of view is quite balanced, and I really appreciate the fact that there's a lot of humility in your words. We all agree that there is a huge problem. I think it's one of the biggest problems humanity has faced for a very, very long time. And we need intelligence. We need discussions to find the right approach. And so, time for discussion. I'm sure we have a lot of questions for you, Ruprecht, to feed the discussion. So please, in the room, just raise your hand if you want to comment, to elaborate on these things, or to ask a question. We have time for that. Not centuries, please. Maybe Frederic, would you, from an economic perspective, what is your point of view about the approach, the European approach of regulation of big techs?
Yes, so in my broken English, I'm sorry, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an English speaker. I am certainly the guy in this room who must try to be to avoid to speak, but I am obliged. I have no question, in fact, but some remarks. You insist on the fact, what is the economic perspective on this topic? In fact, it is all but not economics, because the issue of power, private economic power, is not mandatory an issue of efficiency. It can be, as Ruprecht said, an issue of democracy, an issue of fairness, but not fairness mandatory as social justice, but fairness as loyalty on the market, freedom to access the market, and fair competition in terms of undistorted competition. And one of the points of Ruprecht was essential for me, is a point of sovereignty. The right to freely decide and unilaterally decide its participation to the market. Ruprecht illustrated this point through the case of the consumer, its freedom of choice and so on. But we can imagine this point for the market player, for the undertaking, the dependent undertaking, at the economic point of view, at the technical, technological point of view. That is to say, the case of platform to business relationship. When I am a complementer, when I develop an app, when I sell a product on a marketplace, perhaps I cannot decide freely to access the market. Perhaps I cannot decide freely about my technology, my price, and it can impair, it impairs, in fact, my economic sovereignty. So here, it is not an issue of efficiency. Perhaps it is more efficient to have the same technology, to adjust automatically my price, but it can impair my market liberty. And this example of sovereignty can be translated in another arena. Ruprecht mentioned the case of the ban of the President Trump from Twitter and so on. In fact, here we have the case of the separation of the political sphere and the economic sphere. That is to say, the separation of economic power and political power. For an economist, a standard economist like me, things are very simple. We have the market and the politics and no links between them. But here, what we can see, a monopoly, perhaps for good reasons, I agree with Ruprecht, has decided to ban an access to a political forum. And here we have this difficulty to try to avoid that economic power will be able to induce distortion in political power. It can be also the case in lobbying. We have a lot of possibility of observing such distortion, but here it is an example. And we have to read the dissent of Clarence Thomas at the US Supreme Court in the early April. For me, Clarence Thomas is an originalist, something like a conservative judge, but here we speak about liberty and so on. And perhaps a very last example on perhaps one of the last point of Ruprecht. The necessity to intervene on the market, but the necessity to intervene by respecting the rule of law, by respecting legal standard. It is first a condition to have a policy possible to implement on the market. You quote the courts, the judicial controls of decisions, of the legislations, but also sometimes constitutional values like rule of law, property rights, and so on. And again, we have an example from the States, the debate between Roosevelt, Theodore, and Wilson during the presidential election campaign, sorry, of 1912. We have with Theodore Roosevelt the program of the new nationalism. That is to say, something like an equilibrium between big companies and big government. The program of Roosevelt and the progressists was a program of regulation. That is to say, how to regulate trust in order to avoid to observe an excessive power of this one, but in order to avoid to renounce to efficiency gains. That is to say, how to find a conciliation between economic performance and politics. It was the program of Theodore Roosevelt. On the opposite view, it was the one of Woodrow Wilson, the program of New Freedom, I think. This program was to enforce current antitrust law and perhaps to add additional legislation, additional institutional devices, like, for instance, the FTC 2 years after. That is to say, how to gain an economic expertise on the economics, on the functioning of the markets, and how to intervene, sometimes in a preemptive way, that is to say, to prevent a problem and not to solve one before the antitrust, before the courts with antitrust legislation, with the Sherman Act, and sometimes to address specific practices. See, for instance, the Section 5 of the FTC Act related to unfair commercial practices. So in fact, it is not the economy, it is some greater concerns than economics. It is not an issue of results of the competition, it is an issue of the framework of the rule of competition. I have a terrible English and I speak too much, even in English. I am sorry.
That's great, Fred. Thank you very much. Do you have a comment, Ruprecht?
No, I fully agree. And actually, I wasn't aware of the Wilson and Roosevelt debate. I have to look that up, Frederick. So
you have a fantastic paper of Daniel Crane on this campaign, and also a book of an historian, a US historian, Chase, on this campaign. It was a fascinating campaign. I will send to you the references in a few minutes. I have the book at home.
Okay, thank you so much.
You have terrific papers from Frederick about the history of American antitrust also. You could transfer these papers.
Okay, I will look into that. I wonder, David, if I may turn to your students again for 1 second. I wonder whether they have sort of changed their personal opinions on their use of digital tools when doing this seminar with you. Is there any one of you who wishes to comment on that, or have you?
I would love to hear that.
Since I discussed things a couple of times with my students, and sort of we had sort of very different perspectives once in a while, and I wonder whether that is sort of what's the case here, or whether everyone even agrees that we need to do something about these companies, or whether they are seen as predominantly beneficial.
Okay, the students, don't be shy. Who wants to comment on that? Did you evolve? Yes, Charlotte?
Yes, if I can go. I think that there is something that you said about the right to self-determination that I think it's really interesting and really relevant, because I think that since this year in business law with competition, or even when I studied, it was commercial practices and this kind of thing, and electronic commerce, it doesn't really like revealing on things that I didn't notice before. And I think that this point in your presentation really struck me, because it's, yes, there is something that I'm much more careful about since this year, and the right to self-determination is, yes, really important, and we must do things to ensure that those platforms doesn't choose for us. So I'm quite agree with that.
Thank you, Charlotte. Someone else? Okay. Oh, yes. Oh, Vincent. Hi.
Hi, everyone. So maybe I have one question. Thank you for your presentation, Professor. I have one question about the articulation of between GMA and the similar German tool. I mean, you said that the legal basis of the GMA is Article 114 TFEU. So the aim of this proposal is to avoid the fragmentation of the internal market and the distortion of competition. But, and this is the question, is there not a risk of overlap between these instruments and so finally fragmentation? Thank you for your views about it.
You're giving me the hard questions now.
at the end.
I think you're really hitting the mark, and I fully agree that we have a conflict there at present, and this conflict hasn't been solved really in the current draft of the DMA. If you look into Article 1, 6 or 7, I would need to look it up now, but in Article 1, where they sort of try to devise what is still possible after the DMA is enacted, it's very difficult to see how that should play out. And if you then look into the recitals in the beginning of the act, it becomes even more difficult because, in my view, they clearly make the case that you point at. We want to avoid a fragmentation. That's sort of the dominant feature in the recitals. And then they come in Article 1 and say, yes, but Germany may keep its Section 19A. I mean, they don't put it this way, but sort of in a sense. And this overlap is, or this problem, in my view, is a political problem, in the sense that the member states and the EU Commission need to sort that out. And if I'm speaking about the member states, it's essentially Germany, France, and Italy that are the countries that are interested in having a big, maybe there are others too, but they are sort of they have the strong competition authorities that want to be active in the field. And so they need to know what can we do once the DMA is there. And if the DMA comes into force and Section 19 remains into force, I think that the whole idea of basing this as a harmonization tool or for the internal market doesn't make sense, to be frank. And so my position would be, we need to have a clear cut there, and we should advocate for a clear cut in that field, saying this is exactly sort of what we want to have or not have. On the other hand, you cannot essentially put that into really very good norms, because it's very difficult to put it in a way that it really catches everything, right? I mean, we are all of the opinion, or that is sort of common sense, that normal competition law shall still apply. And so the real question is Section 19A really competition law, or is it not? And will we still see cases of a national competition authority going against Amazon? If they do, does that still make sense? Or is it simply an act of confrontation? So we need a mechanism for that. I think the current solution is not yet the end of that, because otherwise we really run into problems. But finding that solution will be very difficult as well, because it depends on who has the say. I mean, if you look into the trilogue now that we are currently having with the member states, the European Commission, and the Parliament discussing things, the member states don't want to give away their power to deal with competition law cases that are interesting. And the interesting cases are the ones with the big companies. I mean, look at what the Autorité de la Concurrence has done in the past months. And that was very, very strong and very, very good decisions and impressive decisions. And now they sort of sent back to, please do your rural cases in the Normandy, and that's about it. That cannot be the case. And the same goes for Germany, right? So they want to have a say, and they are strong. And in my view, they even need to be involved, because otherwise the European Commission cannot deal with this. They need the national authorities. But if you say that, you probably need something like the European Competition Network, as we have it for Article 101 and 102 enforcement. And that will be more complicated in this field, because the big decisions probably always need to be taken in Brussels. So who is a gatekeeper? What are the obligations they have? And how do these obligations really look at it in practice? Because there needs to be harmonization. And it cannot be that Facebook has a different sort of system in Spain and that's differing from Portugal and France. That's simply sort of that's not the way forward, because that would sort of doesn't make sense with these companies. That's the sort of former thinking. So I have no real answer to that. I see that is an enormous problem, and Germany doesn't want to sort of lose its Section 19A. But personally, I'm advocating that if we get a good European solution, please do away with all national rules. But I don't see a good European solution that does not involve national competition or national authorities, because they will not manage the enforcement without these authorities. But regarding but I think that the question is really absolutely to the point, where, and not just for Section 19A, but essentially also for other abuse provisions. I mean, Section 19A, if you take a conservative view, is just sort of a stronger abuse provision, but you can do the same thing maybe with Article 102 or the national provisions. And if you have these and you take on Google, Facebook, Amazon, or other gatekeepers, you will sort of ridicule the system to a certain degree. So Vincent, if you have a good sort of way out of this, probably everyone's thankful for a good compromise, and I think they need to broker that in the next months.
Thank you so much for your views. Thank you.
Okay, we may have maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes for last comments or not. Well, I think it's late, Ruprecht. I would like to thank you sincerely for your presentation. More on your paper with Philip Madsen will be found on the website. Tell me again, where we can find your report? On the website of your university, or?
I think it's on with the Publishing Foundation. That's the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And okay. I wonder whether we put it up on SSRN as well, but I'm not sure myself now. So.
Okay, at least you can read an interview by Merve Kartapanis of Ruprecht on our website. You can see the address in the chat box. The competition forum was a very interesting interview of Ruprecht. Ruprecht, I would like to thank you once again to join us today. And we are really looking forward to see you in Aix-en-Provence next year. I would like to thank also the students. I'm really, really proud of you. And thank you very much for this very, very good presentation. Thank you, Frédéric, and all the colleagues and the students. Thank you very much. I hope we will meet again very soon. Oh, and I will have in the chat box, the link. That was the paper from Ruprecht and Philippe Madsen. Thank you. Bye bye.
Merci à vous. Merci.
See you on the cours Mirabeau.
Merci à vous.